Hello, welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 22 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about cascading drop-down lists. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 16, 17 and 21 of this video series. First, let's try and understand what we mean by cascading drop-down lists. I've developed a simple ASP.NET web application here which displays three drop-down lists with continents, countries and cities. Now the first one displays the continents. Unless and until I select a continent, I cannot select a country. Based on my continent selection, all the countries within that continent will then be displayed in the countries drop-down list. Okay, and unless and until I select a country, I cannot select the city. So based on my country selection, then all the cities within that country will then be displayed in the cities drop-down list. Okay, let's say I select Bangalore as the Indian city. And then look at what's going to happen when I change my continent. Currently the continent selection is Asia. If I change my selection to Europe, look at this. The cities drop-down list is disabled and select city prompt is shown. And the select countries prompt is shown in the countries drop-down list. And then all the countries within Europe continent are then displayed here. Okay. So this is called as, these drop-down lists are called as cascading drop-down lists. Now let's see how to achieve this. Obviously these drop-down lists are getting their data from a database tables. So let's flip to SQL Server Management Studio. In SQL Server I have already created these sample tables, TBL continents, TBL countries and TBL cities. So if you look at these tables, the data is very simple. In the continents table I have continent ID and continent name columns, and then in the countries table I have the country ID and the country name, and then to associate this country to the continent I also have a continent ID foreign key column. Along the same lines I have cities. In the cities table we have city ID and city name and country ID column. So based on the country ID you can associate which city belongs to which country. So country ID here is the foreign key. Now we have spoken about foreign keys and primary keys in SQL Server video series. So if you haven't watched those, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. Okay, so first let's create some stored procedures. Obviously, if you look at the demo here, now to display this continent data within the continent drop-down list, I need the continent ID and the continent name. So let's create a stored procedure which is capable of returning all the continent IDs and the continent names. Okay. So again, we have spoken about how to create stored procedures in SQL Server video series. If you haven't watched them, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. So create procedure. I want to create this sp get continents stored procedure as begin end. So what we want the continent ID and the continent name from TBL continents table. So continent ID and continent name. Execute that. The stored procedure should get created. Let's test the stored procedure. Highlight the name of the stored procedure, click execute button, so we get the continent ID and continent name. Continent ID will be the value, drop down list item objects value, whereas the continent name will be the text for the list item object, as you can see here. Okay, now for country, look at this. When I select Asia, then we will show all the countries within that continent. So obviously now we don't want to select all the countries. We only want to select countries belonging to a specific continent. So we need to create a stored procedure which takes in a continent ID parameter, and based on that it has to filter the countries that it has to return. Okay, so let's create that stored procedure. So let's copy this. Okay, create procedure get, we want to get all the countries by continent ID. Okay, so let's create that continent ID parameter, and obviously it's an integer data type. So what we want from TBL countries the country ID and the country name. So country ID, country name from TBL countries where continent ID is equal to whatever we are going to pass in to the stored procedure. So obviously, if you select Asia continent, then the Asia, continent ID will be passed in into this stored procedure, which will then return all the countries belonging to the Asian continent. Let's create the stored procedure, execute, and if you want to test the stored procedure, obviously the stored procedure is expecting a parameter continent ID which we need to pass. So let's pass that. Let's say I pass 2 and press F5. I can see all the countries belonging to Europe continent. Okay, the final stored procedure that we want is we want to select all the cities within a country. Okay, so obviously we need a stored procedure which takes in the country ID parameter and returns all the cities within that country. So let's copy this, and I'm going to call this sp-get cities by country ID. And then this is going to take in the country ID parameter. And then we want to select from TBL cities table, and what we need the city ID and the city name. So city ID, city name from TBL cities where country ID is equal to whatever parameter that we are passing in. Here it's country ID. Let's create the stored procedure, execute. Stored procedure created. If you want to test this, let's say I pass in India as the country. I press F5 and you should see all the cities within India. Okay, so we have the stored procedures that are required for our application. Now let's drag and drop 3 drop-down lists onto our web form. So if you look at this, we need 3 drop-down lists, one to display continent, the other one countries, and the other one cities. Okay. Alright, so all I have done until now is created this web form and then added these 3 drop-down lists. And if you look at the source, all I have done now is given those drop-down lists a meaningful name. DDL continents, DDL countries, and DDL cities. Okay, and then I have set the width to 200 pixels so that all of them will have the same size and they look nice. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do, as soon as the page gets loaded, what we need to do, we need to load the continents. Okay, now since we have 3 stored procedures, we will be calling them over and over again. When you select the continent, you have to go back to the database and then call the other stored procedure, sp-get countries by continent ID, and then once you select your country, you need to call the city stored procedure. So there are going to be a lot of database calls. So obviously let's write a generic method which is capable of executing these procedures so we can reuse that. Okay, so let's go to the code behind page of this web form. So I'm going to write a private method because I intend to use this method only within this web form. So private, and what is this method going to do? It's going to return a data set, and obviously data set is present in system.data namespace. So let's import that, and obviously we are writing ADO.NET code, so we also need system.data.sql client. Again, we have spoken about ADO.NET in detail in ADO.NET video series. If you haven't watched that, I would strongly encourage you to do so before continuing with the session. And obviously we want to read the connection string from web.config file, so system.configuration namespace is required. Okay, so private, this method is going to return a data set back, and then let's call this get data as the name of the method. And what is this method going to do? This method is going to take in a stored procedure name, and obviously stored procedure name is of type string, so I'm going to call this string sp name. And another parameter, if you look at the stored procedures that we want to execute, there are 3 stored procedures. Okay, the first stored procedure doesn't take any parameters because we want all the continents, but then the country stored procedure and the city stored procedure takes parameter. Okay, so obviously we also want to pass in a parameter object to this stored procedure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another parameter of type SQL parameter, and let's call this sp parameter. Okay, So the first thing that we have to do is to read the connection string from web.config file. So I already have the connection string defined here. dbcs is the name of the connection string which we need to read from the web.config file. So let's read that and store it in this variable cs. And to read the connection string, we can make use of configuration manager dot connection strings of, what's the name of the connection string in our case, dbcs. Copy that. Dot connection string will return the connection string, and all we need to do now is to create the SQL connection object. So create the new SQL connection object, passing in the connection string, and create the SQL data adapter. Okay, so now you need to pass in the stored procedure name that you want to execute. Okay, now we don't want to hard code the name of the stored procedure here, because later we will be calling this method from different places. Okay, so let's pass in the stored procedure name here. Okay, we pass in the parameter, and then obviously you need to specify the connection object. So I'm going to pass the connection object, and all we have to do now is create a data set, and then fill that data set with data. So da.fill ds, the data set. But there's one more thing that we have to do. Here we are going to execute a stored procedure. So we need to tell the data adapter object that it is executing a stored procedure. So da.select command type is equal to command type dot stored procedure. And we have spoken about all this ADO.NET code within ADO.NET video series. Okay, another thing that you will have to specify, if you look at the procedures that we have, some of them takes in parameters and some of them doesn't take parameters. Okay, so from wherever we call this method, if we don't pass in a parameter, then you can pass in null. Okay, when you pass in null, you don't want to add this parameter object to the stored procedure. You will understand that in a bit. When we actually call this method, that's when it makes more sense. Okay, but at this point what we need to do is we need to check, okay, if the sp parameter is not equal to null, meaning if somebody has passed a parameter object, then what we need to do, we need to associate this parameter object with this stored procedure. And how do we do that? da.select command dot parameters dot add method. And if you look at the add method, it takes in a SQL parameter object. Do we have the SQL parameter object? Yes, that's coming in as a parameter. So I'm going to pass this to this parameters collection using the add method. That's all. Finally, after you fill the data set, you need to return that back to the caller, whoever calls this method, because the return type of this method is data set. Okay, all done. We have written a reusable method to execute any kind of stored procedure. Okay, so the first thing that we have to do initially when the page loads, we want to show the continents. Okay, so if not is post back, so if it is the initial get request of the page, what we need to do, we need to load the continents data. And to load the continents data, you can simply call this method get data and then specify the name of the stored procedure that we want to execute. What's the name of the stored procedure? sp get continents. So I'm going to pass this to this method. Okay, and the next thing that we want to do is this method is also expecting a SQL parameter object. Okay, but then do we need to pass any parameter to this sp get continent stored procedure? We don't have to. Okay, because it returns all the continent IDs and continent names. Okay, so in this case I just pass null. So when you pass null, what is going to happen? This block will be executed only if it is not null. In this case it is null, so it's not going to pass that, it's not going to associate that parameter object to the command, because we don't need that anyways here. Alright, so and if you look at this method, it's returning the data set back. And what does that data set contains? It contains the continent ID and continent name. So we want to associate that with our continents drop down list, which is the first one. Okay, so the name of the drop down list is ddl continents dot data source is equal to whatever data set that gets returned, and the other thing that we have to do is call the data bind method. That's it. So once we run this application now, it should display all the continents within the first drop-down list, but there wouldn't be anything in the second drop-down list and the third one. But then if you look at the first drop-down list, it's not showing the actual data, it's showing system.data.data row view, and you should know from the previous sessions in this video series that's because we haven't specified the data text field and data value field. Okay, and we can do that either in code or in the HTML source. So let's do that in the HTML source. So data text field is equal to, what's the column name? Continent name. So I'm going to use the continent name as the data text field, and data value field is going to be the continent ID. So copy that column name. That's it. So now if we run this, as you expect, it should display the continent ID and the continent name. Okay, which is good. But then, it's displaying the continent names alone here. I want a prompt as well. Please select continent. I want that prompt within this drop down list, but we don't have that data within the database table, so we have to programmatically add that to the drop down list. And we have seen from the previous sessions of this video series, a drop down list is actually a collection of list item objects. So all we need to do is to create a list item object and add it to the drop down list. How do we do that? So list item li is equal to new list item. Let's give this a meaningful name, li continent. Okay, and if you look at the constructor of the list item class, it takes in two parameters, the text and the value. The text is going to be select continent, and then the value is going to be -1. Okay, and what we need to do, we need to add this to the continent drop down list. And how do I do that? There are two ways. You can use the add method, but then when you add it using the add method, this list item will be appended to the end of the drop down list, but we don't want that. We want that to be present on the top, so I'm going to use the insert method of the items collection. So drop down list ddl continents dot items dot insert, and you can specify the index where you want to insert. Since I want to insert it at the top of the drop down list, I use 0, and then the next parameter is the list item object itself. That's it. And another thing that we have to do is we also have to specify this select country within the second drop down list and select city for the third drop down list. So you can simply copy paste this code and change it as required. Okay, so this is going to be li country, and the prompt that we want is, instead of select continent, it's going to be select country, and then we will add that to the countries drop down list. So ddl countries, and this is going to be li city, and here we will say select city, li city, and it's going to be ddl city drop down list. Okay, that's it. So with that, if we go ahead and run our application now, it should display all the continents, show that prompt select continents, select country, and select city. Okay, but then another thing that we have to do is this drop down list, the country and city drop down list should be disabled until I make a selection of the continent. But now these are enabled. Okay, I don't want that to happen. So I want these to be disabled on the initial page load. How do we do that? All you have to do is set the enabled property to false. So ddl countries dot enabled is equal to false, and we do the same thing for the cities drop down list. That's it. So once we run this now, on the initial page load the continents will be displayed, but the country and city drop down list are disabled. Upon selecting my continent, what should happen? The page should refresh and the country drop down list should be enabled, and all the countries belonging to the selected continent should be displayed in the country drop down list. So let's see how to do that. First of all, you should enable the countries drop down list. And when should you do that? Whenever the selection in the drop down list changes. Okay, and we know that drop down list exposes an event called selected index changed. Okay, so let's go to the Visual Studio, flip to the design mode. So whenever the selection in the drop down list changes, double click that, the selected index changed event handler will be generated. So the first thing we want to do is whenever the selection changes, but then that selection has to be, you have to select a continent. So if ddl continents dot selected index is equal to 0, if the selected index is 0, then you don't want to enable the continents drop down list. You want to enable them only if the selected index is not equal to 0. Okay, we'll come back to this this if condition in a bit, but first let's write the else part. So what do we want to do? We want to first enable the countries drop down list. So ddl countries.enabled is equal to true. So that will enable the countries drop down list. What we need to do next, we need to load all the countries belonging to the selected continent. We know that if the selected index is not equal to 0, it will come to the else part, which means the user has actually selected a continent. Okay, so now we need to pass that selected continent ID to the database stored procedure and then retrieve all the countries belonging to that continent. And we already have a reusable method which we can use to call the stored procedure. So I'm going to call this get data stored procedure. So get data, and we need to pass this a stored procedure name. What is the stored procedure? We want to call sp get countries by continent ID. So that's the name of the stored procedure. And then if you look at this method actually expects a SQL parameter object. And what is that? Continent ID. And we know, when we actually run this, when you select your continent, what's going to happen? The selected continent ID is going to come from this first continent drop down list. So we need to first harvest it from there. So let's create the SQL parameter object. SQL parameter, let's call this parameter is equal to new SQL parameter. And if you look at the constructor of this one, the SQL parameter class, it takes in two parameters, the parameter name and the value of the parameter. Okay, so the parameter name for this stored procedure is @continent_id. So I'm going to pass that. And the second thing that you have to specify is the value. So where is the value coming from? The value is coming from the continents drop down list. Okay, so how do I get that? ddl continents dot selected value. That's all. So we have the SQL parameter object now. All you have to do is pass in the parameter object to this method. And we know this method is returning a data set. So let's create a data set. ds is equal to whatever this method returns. And all you need to do now is to set this data set as the data source for your countries drop down list. So ddl countries dot data source is equal to data set, and finally you need to call the data bind method. And one last thing that you have to do is to specify the data text field and the data value field for this countries drop down list, and we can do that in the HTML. So let's do that there. So this is the countries drop down list. So data text field. So what's our data text field going to be? That's going to be the country name, and data value field is going to be the country ID. Perfect. So now if we run this, as you might expect, it should disable all the continents, and then initially the countries and cities drop down list will be disabled. Upon selecting my continent, the countries drop down list should be enabled. But then look at this, nothing is happening. Okay, why is that? Because by default the selected index changed event of the drop down list is cached event. It's not a post back event. Okay, so we need to convert the cached event of the drop down list to a post back event by setting the auto post back property to true. And how do we do that? Set the auto post back property to true. So now whenever the selection in the drop down list changes, it will automatically post back to the server. So I select my continent, look at that. The countries drop down list got enabled and it added all the countries. But the problem here is you lost that prompt. So let's go ahead and add that select country prompt. And when do we do that? Within the drop down list selected index change. So all you have to do is copy that piece of code and then paste it within the selected index changed event. That's it. So now when we run this, as you might expect, it should show the select country as well within the selection of the drop down list. So I change the continent to Asia. You see all the Asian countries and then select country. Okay, and similarly if I change my continent to South America, then you should see all the countries within South America. Okay, cool. Now the next thing that we want to do is whenever I change my selection to select continent, what should happen? Okay, look at this. We'll come back to that piece later, but as soon as I select my country, let's say I select Asia as the continent, I select India as the country, what should happen? The cities drop down list should be populated. So obviously we do that in the selected index changed event of the countries drop down list. So let's do that now. So I go to the countries drop down list, double click that, the event handler gets generated. All you have to do is copy this code and change it. It's going to be pretty much similar, and all you have to do is just change some object names here. Okay, so if the country's selected index, so if the country's selected index is 0, that means he has not selected anything. We'll come back to that part later. But if it is not equal to 0, that means he has selected a country, in which case we want to load all the cities. Okay, so which means you need to enable the cities drop down list. So I'm going to say ddl cities dot enabled is equal to true, and then we need to create the SQL parameter to call the cities stored procedure. sp gets cities by country id. So obviously the name of the stored parameter is at country id. So instead of continent ID, it will be country ID. And then instead of continent's selected value, it will be country's selected value. Alright, and the procedure that we want to call is sp get cities by country ID. And we pass in that parameter there. So obviously this will return a data set, and we want to set that as the data source for our cities drop down list. Okay, and then the final thing that you have to do is to specify the data text field and data value field for the cities drop down list. So let's specify that. So data text field, what's our data text field? City name. And data value field is going to be the city ID. So let's copy that. And one last thing you have to do is you want to set the auto post back property of the countries drop down list to true. Otherwise it will not post back upon selection change within the countries drop down list. So set the auto post back property of the countries drop down list to true. Okay, so let's go back to the web form, see if we have missed anything. Yep. And the last thing that we have to do, we have to add that select city prompt. And then we need to add that to the cities drop down list and give this a meaningful name. It's going to be li city. That's it. So let's run this now. As you might expect, everything should be functional now, the continents, countries and cities. So I select a continent, Asia, and I select India as the country, and I see all the countries, all the cities within Indian country, within Indian country. Yep. Okay. But then the problem here is, look at this. I select Bangalore, and then when I go back to the first drop down list and then change my continent to Europe, let's say, look at that, the countries gets refreshed and all the countries are shown, but then look at the cities drop down list. Okay, it is still showing Bangalore. That's incorrect. We want this drop down list to be automatically defaulting to select city, and then it should be disabled until I select my country. So how do I do that? I have to do that on the selected index changed event of the continents drop down list. Okay, there are two things to do. Obviously the data is getting loaded as expected, but the problem is with the cities drop down list. You need to set, if whatever may be the initial selection they made, you need to reset the selection to the first item, and then you need to disable the cities drop down list. How do we do that? So obviously we do that within the selected index changed event of the continents drop down list. Okay, so whenever the selection here changes, I want to say the selected index of cities is going to be 0, which means the first item, and then we want to disable the cities drop down list. Okay, so let's run this and see if that is working as expected. Okay, so I select the continent Asia, select the country as India, I select a city within India. Now I go here and change Europe as my continent. Look at what's going to happen. The cities drop down list is disabled as expected, and countries, select country and all the countries within the Europe is shown. Okay, so this is working as expected. Now I select the United Kingdom and I see all the cities within United Kingdom. Okay, but on the other hand, now when I change it to South America, it's working as expected again. When I flip to select continent, look at that. When I flip to select continent, what should happen now? Select country should be disabled. If you don't select a continent, this should be disabled until you select a continent. So when do we do that? So if the selected index of the continent is 0, which means he hasn't made a selection there, then in that case we want to disable the countries drop down list. So we want to say that to false, and we also want to set the selected index to 0, which means the first item, default to the first item. Okay, so now let's run this and see if it works as expected. Okay, I select a continent, Europe, I select some country, and then when I change my selection, look at that. It's only disabling this one, but it's not disabling the cities. So we need to disable this drop down list and default the selection to the first item. And how do we do that? You do it here. Exact same code, but you change the ID of the drop down list. Here it's going to be DDL cities. So now when we run this, it should work as expected. Okay, so I select continent as Asia, select Japan as the country, Hiroshima as the city. Now if I say select continent, look at that, they get disabled and then work as expected. Okay, now I make a selection. Now look at this. When I say select country, the cities drop down list should be disabled and the selection should be defaulted to the first one for the cities drop down list. So let's see how to do that, and obviously we have to do that in the selected index changed event of the cities drop down countries drop down list. So if the selected index is 0, that means you haven't made a selection, in which case we want to set the selected item to the first one and I do that using selected index, and we want to disable the selection. And you set the enabled property of cities drop down list to false. So obviously when we run this now, it should be fully working as expected. So I select a continent, I select a country, and I come to the city, I select city, and then when I go back and select, say, country, look at that, this gets disabled. Along the same lines, if I say select continent, this gets disabled. So unless and until you select a continent, you cannot select a country. Unless and until you select a country, you cannot select the city. Okay, I select my city, and then when I change my selection of select continent to select continent, look at that. Okay, so now these are the cascading drop down lists. Now if you look at this code, within the code behind file, there's a lot of code. Now if you actually carefully spend some time, you can drastically reduce this code by refactoring it. Okay, wherever you have copy pasted those code, anytime you're copy pasting more than 3 lines of code, then it should ring the bell. You should know that you should be refactoring that, put that common code in one place, and then whatever is varying, pass them in as parameters, so that you can reduce the amount of code that we have to write. And what are the advantages of having reduced code? Number one, maintenance will be much easier, and you have less code to unit test later. So obviously, you can maintenance become easier, less number of bugs, etc. It saves a lot of time and effort. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.